or torpedo bombers. Um, Aldersdale seemed to bear a charmed life. We had a captain on board called Hurricane Hobson. He was known as Hurricane Hobson because every place he went, apparently, and anchored, it blew a gale of wind, and his nickname eventually became Hurricane Hobson. But he was quite a character, very cool, and as I say, he himself thought that we had a charmed life. But eventually, the ship was hit by a torpedo. The first torpedo slid across the deck and didn't explode, but something else hit us in the stern. We don't know what. We think it was a torpedo. Independence Day, 1942, and I was the third officer. I was the youngest person on the ship except for the galley boy, and my job was to make sure that all the confidential books were dumped over the side in weighted containers. The ship was listing, but not very much, and there was no fire. The engines had stopped because apparently the main casting had cracked across. She was a motor ship. The second officer, who was the navigator, was a man called Cairns, who'd been ashore throughout the whole of the war, before the war, between the wars, and he'd come back for the war. And one of the navigator's jobs was to keep all the charts up to date, which meant you corrected them red ink mostly. And Cairns was meticulous. He was absolutely meticulous in his correction of charts. And when the ship was hit, obviously a lot of things happened. The engine was struck, but some of the windows broke in the wheelhouse. All the drawers came out because the ship shuddered. All the drawers came out. All the loose equipment flew all over the place. Cairns' charts shot out of all the drawers. The red ink fell over everything. And I can remember Cairns coming in, because he was outside at the time on the wing of the bridge. He said, "Bloody hell," he said, "all that work gone to pot. Look at it." And he was more concerned about that than no one panicked. We all knew we'd been hit by something. The captain of the ship, Hobson, had been out in the wing of the bridge at the time with one of the signalmen standing in front of him and this Hotchkiss resting on the signalman's shoulder while he was trying to shoot at these aircraft. The gunners on the foredeck had been trying to shoot at aircraft with 4-inch surface missiles. They were designed for shooting ships, not shooting aircraft. Everybody'd been busy doing something. When we dumped all the all the confidential books and so on, I then went to my station, which was the starboard lifeboat, if I remember. When I got there, there was no starboard lifeboat there. It had gone. I could see it slightly in the distance. I went back in, and there was no one in the wheelhouse except for the captain. I said, "I think the lifeboat has gone, sir." He said, "Yes." He said, "We'll have to." He said, "I have to go and get some stuff out of the safe." I went to the port lifeboat. That also had gone because we had been rather a long time getting rid of papers and things. So at that moment, the third engineer came along and said, "The boats have gone with the crew." He said, "I don't think there's anyone left on board now except we three." So we went down below, and the old man fished out a bottle of rum, and we had a bottle of rum. And I remember I picked up my sextant. I can't think why I picked up my sextant, and put my watch on. And we had, in those days, big sheepskin coats with a canvas cover on for winter work. But by this time, the air temperature was quite high. It was in its 60s. And so we decided to go aft and launch one of the small jolly boats. We could then see the damage. The flying bridge was all twisted. The ship had obviously had a twist in the after end. And with that, a young engineer from Manchester came up and said, in a broad Manchester accent, asked where everybody was. And I said, "Are you all right?" Well, I can't think of his name for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "except what colour is blood?" And we just saw then that he had got blood all over his face and he'd had a cut of some sort. So we launched the jolly boat, and there were, by this time, someone else turned up. There were 5 of us in the jolly boat with very few possessions. I had just the clothes I stood up in and my sextant. The captain had a dispatch bag with some gear in. The engineer had salvaged an alarm clock. Why he picked up this alarm clock, we don't know. And off we headed in the direction of Nova Zembla, I suppose. But we were picked up about 2 hours later by a small naval ship called HMS Britomart. And Britomart picked us up and said, "We can't leave Aldersdale where she is." By this time the ship was listing, but showed no inclination to sink very quickly. Britomart was manned mainly by RNVR people, and one of the more hilarious parts of this was where she decided to try and sink us with gunfire, and she elevated the gun to put the shell in the breech, trained it on the ship, fired, and the shell went over the ship somewhere. It was obviously not the right angle. This time they elevated the gun, the breech fell off, and the gunnery officer reported that the gun was no longer available. The captain of the Britomart decided then that if we could throw a depth charge underneath the ship, it might hasten her end. And to my absolute horror, he steamed up at full speed within about 30 feet of the ship. They threw a depth charge over the side. Fortunately for us, it didn't go off. Otherwise, I think we'd have blown ourselves up as well. They had another go, and then suddenly there was a small explosion on board the ship from somewhere, and she burst into flames. And I understand, although I didn't see her sink, she went down about some 6 or 7 hours later in a mass of flame.
How long had you been in the jolly boat for?
About 2 hours, I think it was. There were ships. It was before that. Yeah, before this, I was wondering why we hadn't been picked up by the rescue ship. But about the day before, I think it was probably on the 3rd of July, we'd had an order that the convoy was to scatter. And all the naval surface ships withdrew to the west. We were left with 2 trawlers, the Sheffield Wednesday and the something else, 2 submarines, and a couple of these small gunboats. They were more like river gunboats than warships. And then the convoy scattered, and people have said, well, probably that was the best thing to do. But when you realize that for 30-odd ships to scatter, to lose sight of one another in a 24-hour daylight situation with blue sea and so on, almost impossible. There had been fog banks, and Aldersdale had been using the fog banks to try and avoid enemy action. But it took a long, long time, 48 hours possibly, for ships to get out of sight of one another. And I've often thought about this and wondered, well, it might have been better if the commodore of the convoy had said, sorry, let the escort vessels disappear, but if we keep together, we have a better chance of protecting one another. There was certainly enough gunfire, but we didn't. We scattered, and of course they were picked off one by one. We eventually made, by this time we were somewhere south of Bear Island, I think, and we eventually made Natochkin Straits, the other side of Nova Zembla, to the east side of the islands, and we transferred to another ship and made then for Archangel. But
Transfer to another merchant ship?
no, we transferred to another similar class gunboat. I can't remember her name for a minute. But they were good to us, but they were overcrowded. They had a lot of survivors on board. And of course there was an ice field lying between Nova Zembla and the entrance to the White Sea. One ship, the Samuel Chase, I think, an American, she had gone straight into the ice field, put all her fires out, whitewashed her decks, and was almost indistinguishable from the ice. And she was there for a little while. But eventually we made for the entrance. We were greeted by a Russian frigate of some sort, which was a wood burner. More smoke and flames coming out of the funnel than anything I've ever seen. And she was our escort in. But before that, the HMS Norfolk had launched a walrus before the convoy had scattered to do recce work. And when the walrus returned, the Norfolk had gone. So there was nowhere for the walrus to go. So she landed on the water and was actually towed, I think by the Commodore ship, into the back of Natochkin Straits, where she was lifted aboard a merchant ship and brought to Archangel. And I can remember well the name of two of the crew. One was a man called Wignall from Liverpool. I think Wignall was either the pilot or the observer, and a chap called Riley, who was also either pilot or observer, one of the two. And when we'd settled into Archangel, there was a ceremony where these two gentlemen and their air gunner wireless operator, whose name I cannot remember, handed her over to the Russians ceremoniously. Because the Russians had a thing called, it looked like a walrus, except that instead of the conventional type pulling system propeller, they had a pusher on the back end. They pushed it along. It was like a primitive walrus. It obviously was a petrol engine, because unlike most of their stuff up there. So it was quite an experience for these people as well, and says something for the walrus. It was towed all that way, and still, I imagine, flew afterwards. To be towed at sea like that. But Archangel was a bit of an eye-opener. Quite primitive in some ways. There were, I imagine, about 1,000 survivors ashore, because we learned afterwards that out of the 36 ships that left Iceland, only about 10 arrived, and some of those were escort vessels. So it was quite a substantial loss of ship and a substantial loss of lives. One young man, I remember, he lost through frostbite, through exposure in the water. They had to amputate both his legs below the knee. And he was a Glaswegian. And he kept asking the doctors who did the operation if they could fit him with legs, because he was a mad keen footballer. He wanted to be able to play football, at least amateur, when he got back to Scotland. Amazing young chap. Another one there, whom I met again after the war, He was sunk 4 times in one convoy. From a curly, black-headed young man, he turned in almost overnight into almost white-haired, bent, and very, very nervous young man, middle-aged. Turned him overnight virtually.
That was in PQ-17, was it?
He'd been in a convoy in PQ-17 and in the return convoy, because the return convoy had pretty bad time. But the Russians were pretty good to us as much as they could, because it was a frontline town virtually. They put us up in a hospital, the only place they could accommodate all these people. Some of the beds left a lot to be desired, they're blood-stained and so on from the previous occupants, but and they fed us the best they could. Mostly porridge, a type of porridge was a staple diet. They used that as a breakfast cereal and as a main course, part of the main course. Everyone said that what we were eating was either yak meat or something else. It was pretty grisly. But they used to put gravy on top of the porridge then. And then tea, meal at night was usually black bread, and occasionally we'd get cheese or butter or something like that. But then we were better off than a lot of the inhabitants. They were cut off. I made friends with a family there because the main entertainment in the town was an open-air dance floor, and the Russians, at least my observation was that the Russians danced where everyone stood in the middle of the floor, and you danced around the outside. Whereas in England, UK rather, everyone sits outside and you dance in the middle. And I met a young lady there called Nina Basanova, who introduced me to her parents, and her father had been a professor of English in Leningrad University, and they had survived the whole of the Leningrad siege. And I remember asking Professor Basanova what it was like, and he said it was not very nice. They were reduced to literally eating anything that moved and could be killed. They ate it for protein. And then they moved from there to, as soon as they could get out, to Archangel, and they were in a family of 5, I think it was, in one room, sharing a communal kitchen with about 10 other families. And they stayed there until they were moved to another place further away. I often wonder, in fact, if my friendship with the family was the cause of the problem, because we were very carefully watched by the Russian Secret Service. The other entertainment there was the Inn Tourist Club, which was strictly controlled. But you went there and you could buy Russian beer, Russian onion beer, I think it was called. Although I didn't drink in those days, and at least very little. It didn't bother me very much. You could also get ersatz drinks, and occasionally you could buy fruit from the from the free market. And that's why I got involved with the Russian naval choir. They had a naval choir there. They were all recruits, but because they could sing, they formed part of the entertainment. And the compere was a big, tall Russian guy who couldn't speak English. But my job with him was to set out the program phonetically, read it to him phonetically. He would write it down phonetically in Russian, and then he would stand up and almost without trace of accent would recite it, and he would think that he was fluent in English because of the way he put it across. And we had some very interesting times there. Then the Russians, because we were being bombed regularly by the Germans, they moved us from there into an hotel because they needed the accommodation for the wounded troops and so on. The hotel was not bad. There was already a group of British servicemen there um, who were part of the naval attaché staff, I think. But they put us in a room upstairs. We couldn't understand. There were 6 of us sleeping in the one room, just enough room for a couple of double beds and some single beds. And we couldn't understand why we couldn't sleep. There were straw mattresses. But every night, once the lights went out, the room was infested with bed bugs. And we tried to eliminate them. We couldn't. In the end, we moved out and took up residence with friends in other parts of the hotel where there were no bed bugs. But the bombing was often and frequent, and because most of the houses there were wood, the incendiaries were pretty lethal. And the chap Harris, who went for the swim in Valfiord in the freezing cold, was a big chap from South Wales. He was the radio operator, and he and I were particularly friendly. And one night the Russians actually called for volunteers because 2 streets had gone on fire, and the flames were licking from the wooden huts on one side to the wooden huts on the other, right across the open ground. So Harris and I helped to move furniture out and so on, and we saw this wooden building in between 2 rows of houses, and one row was totally on fire. The stone or brick chimneys were glowing red hot in amongst the flames. You could see it. So we decided we would knock this building down, so we had make a fire break. So we recruited a couple of Russians and some of our boys, and Harris, who was a big lad, picked up this enormous telegraph pole at one end. We got hold of the rest, and he said, right, now we'll charge across and knock this thing down with one fell swoop. So we roared across this piece of ground, and Harris was about 6 feet from the end of the pole, and we hit it, but unfortunately, in the sort of gloom, we hit the door. So Harris disappeared inside, and there was a bit of a gurgling sound and some very bad language, and he emerged from the doorway of a semi-wrecked hut, dripping with the remains of the cesspit. He'd gone into a communal lavatory and actually had dropped into the pool, so we had to then take him down to the River Dvina, which is the main river there. There were rafts of wooden logs ready for milling, and Harris took all his clothes off